Welcome to the Inner West Library Speaker Series. We would like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal and the Wongal people of the Eora Nation on which this podcast is produced. Today, we are joined by Kerry Choy, a keen genealogist and self-confessed geek who decided to get serious about genealogy and researching his Chinese Australian ancestry after helping his children research the family tree numerous times for school assignments. Since then, Kerry has completed a graduate diploma of local, family, and applied history and now volunteers his time and family history knowledge at the Chinese Australian Historical Society. Welcome, Kerry.
G'day, thanks for having me on.
Researching your family history has become an increasingly popular pastime over the last few years with numerous television programs such as Who Do You Think You Are? And Every Family Has a Secret. Can you tell me why you think researching your family history has become so popular in recent years, and why is it becoming more important for people to do this?
Popularity in recent years has been really probably fueled by that sense of where are we from? We've matured a bit. There was a time when probably as a society we would have been a little bit embarrassed about having a convict background. Now we celebrate it. So I think we can look around and we can celebrate so many different things. So it's not surprising really that people have been interested in investigating their convict backgrounds, and now I think investigating their Chinese backgrounds, which has also been a bit of a closed door in the past. So that's another one that's now open. There are so many things that people can actually be challenged about their identity and who they are, and TV programs do that. The whole sense of who we are in Australia now, that's supposed to probably feeling that as well. That's one side of it.
How did you become involved in researching your Chinese Australian history? And can you provide some background information on the role that you play with the Chinese Australian History Organisation?
Obviously, I'm Chinese surname. So when I began this exercise, my understanding was that all of my ancestors were actually of Chinese background. So I started doing these exercises with my children. We do the family tree exercise 1 year, and then 2 years later, when the next kid came along, I do it again. So after several attempts at doing this, I realised I probably need to actually just get this a little bit more regularised and get it laid out better. And so I started to do some of the reading about how you should record your genealogies, and it all went spiraling out of control from there. So I've been doing that. I've found all sorts of interesting things about my own family history of my wife and family. So while I thought had a all Chinese background, detailed research has now proven that I probably actually have an Irish great grandmother.
Oh,
So
that's
that was kind
interesting.
of we didn't know about that. So that was interesting. And then working through my wife's side, who's a more colonial Australian sort of background, yes, we've got the mandatory convicts in the family tree. I think there's about 15. I've found it a fascinating exercise of seeing what history looks like for an Australian family to have so many convicts in the family tree and to have so many of them turn out to be policemen who were convicts as well. So it's been a really interesting exercise for me to find all this history and be able to pass it on to my children.
So, did your children find it quite an interesting exercise as well? Were they quite surprised to see what relations sort of came up?
Occasionally they look at it. I think what we seem to find more broadly too is that someone in the family gets the bug, they get the interest in family history, and they become the bit of the go-to person. So they end up collecting all this stuff and organising it and documenting it, putting it in shoeboxes or whatever. And then occasionally people come to them and say, "Oh, what about so and so?" And they'll find out about that, and then they'll sort of wander away again. In each generation, someone picks up the baton, and hopefully we find someone to pass it on to in the next generation to be able to pass all the information and recorded knowledge on. But a lot of family aren't interested in it until they find they are, and the tragedy is that sometimes when they actually start asking the questions about their family history, they find it's too late because people who could have told them all that stuff, all of their elders, have passed on, and that becomes one of the tragedies, and people might start too late sometimes.
So, a lot of that family knowledge is then lost to everyone else.
I won't say it's totally lost, but it certainly becomes more difficult.
And so, when you were researching your family history, it obviously there were a few little surprises in there.
Yeah, my grandfather, during his lifetime, he did not have a birth certificate. He had an idea about when he was born, but we were never able to nail down his birth certificate. So we didn't have that certainty. With the advent of online indexes and the ability to be a little bit sort of more wildcard searching in what you can look for in the archives and records, we actually found out a record which actually was his name, but his name with another surname, which we didn't know about. We confirmed that record as being the link between who he thought he was and his birth name. That tracked a whole lot of interesting research.
I suppose I wanted to know just sort of what your role was with the Chinese Australian History Organisation. Obviously, you're a volunteer there, and that's because of your love of genealogy. And obviously, you want to help people, other people, finding out about their past as much as possible. So, can you tell me a little bit about your role with that organisation?
I've been on there with this society for a few years now. My primary interest is in family history. Obviously, a family history is a very personal thing. It's about your family, but your family sits within the story of a society. And the history society is more generally about the history of the Chinese Australians more widely, a more generic sort of look at history. It's good to have a reading in both. It's good to actually have understanding and do research for your family, but it's good to understand the context in which they live and the society they grew up in, because that informs your research. So understanding what Australia policy helps me understand what to research and how to research. So these backwards and forwards between specific history of my family and the general history of Chinese in Australia. So I sort of flick around between those two threads of interest, and that really is my passion in being involved with this society.
For someone who's never done any family research before and they've decided to start researching their Chinese Australian family history, where should they start? And I suppose the other question is it any different than for people researching their family history from, say, a colonial Australian background?
There are a few answers to that. In one sense, it is no different to doing any other sort of family research, whether you're researching in Australia or in France or in the or in the US. The methods are the same. The recommendation is always you start with yourself, and then you research backwards from there. So you confirm, look for records like birth certificates and official documentation letters to confirm the relationships going backwards from yourself to your parents, to your grandparents, to your great grandparents. So that mechanism is the same whether you have Chinese Australian backgrounds or not. The methods of organising research material and recording it and analysing it. Those methods are the same. They're quite well developed now. The library has would itself have a lot of access to resources that help people do family history research. There's plenty of good stuff to start with there. But for Chinese Australian history, there's probably some extra cultural context which people may be aware of. If you're coming at this exercise knowing that you have a Chinese Australian link, then you probably know some of that already. You may have a family that has celebrated its Chineseness already. There are plenty of families who might have the Chinese affectionate name for their grandparents rather than just say grandpa or papa. They might use a Chinese affectionate like Gung or Popo, which that actually is a Chinese cultural thing. So some people have come at this from having no cultural startup point. That's where maybe that Chinese link has been either lost or forgotten about or suppressed. So there may be some things that you might need to actually become aware with once you've gone through some research and you found a record and the record has a name on it. You think, I didn't know that there's a Chinese name there in the records before. So once you've got that point, then maybe you need to just have a bit of a more broader reading rather than just done the normal school history about convicts. Maybe you need to do a little bit more reading about some of the other aspects of Australian history, which maybe you haven't touched on before, like the impact of the White Australia policy on Chinese and Australian history, which is quite significant and is an important thing to understand so that you understand how your ancestors fitted in society, maybe why they did some of the things they did, and what sort of records we can actually look for, because the White Australia policy, despite it being a kind of a bit of a black episode in many respects and unfortunate in many respects, it created a treasure trove of records. The bureaucracy that was created by that is very useful for people who are doing family history research.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? It was what cultural contexts do you think are important to understand to begin researching your Chinese family history? So I suppose it was that the White Australia policy that you mentioned, but were there any other cultural contexts there that may influence the research?
There's a whole lot of things about Chinese names, habits, which if you're not familiar with, you might trip you up. The first thing that people will have to hit is issues around names and around Chinese names in Australian records. Probably the thing that will hit first, particularly if you're coming at it from the point of view of looking at the records, is to understand that the records in Australia will have transcribed names that Chinese people gave to the officials of the day, and it may not have actually been the name that is most useful for doing research.
So that makes it a bit tricky, doesn't it?
Yeah. To explain, my great grandfather, he is in all of the Australian records because he came to Australia in 1896. There's a nice paper trail of immigration records, and in all the records, his name is recorded as Ah Young. His actual family name for the name in the Chinese sort of family records, and his formal name is Choi Man Soy. There's not much not much commonality between those two. Ah Young is a courtesy name. There are sort of cultural reasons why he would have used that name when the guy at the immigration desk says, "What's your name?" There are cultural reasons why he would have replied with "Ah Young" rather than Choi Mansoy. Too long for this exercise, maybe for another cast. But the point is that Ah Young became the name that was used in the Australian records. So all the way through to his death and onto his tombstone, Ah Young has been recorded. You would not be able to go to China and say, "Hey, can you tell me who Ah Young is?" It's kind of a nickname it's a courtesy name. It's about as meaningful as an Australian nickname. Like, if someone came to Australia saying that they're looking for a guy that they think his name's called Bluey or Curly, it's a nickname that might identify him in a context, but it wouldn't be able to identify him in any of the formal contexts that you would use for searching records.
And I mean, there could be lots of people using that name as well.
There are plenty of Blues and Curlies in the world too. So
That's right. So that does make it a little bit difficult, doesn't it?
understanding that there's maybe multiple names involved, that's one of the things people need to start with. Then there's just the mechanic of Chinese names, that the surname is normally given first in a form, let's say like Choi Mansoy. That's my family name is Choi. That led to all sorts of confusion, particularly in the record keepers, because when colonial people wrote down names, they assumed that the last one that they got was the actual family name. So some of the people we have recorded in Australian records, their names are backwards. They're the name that has come down through the records as their family name, and often the name that their family actually adopted as their Australian name, that's not actually their real family name. That's actually someone's given name back in the past. That becomes even funnier because people will say they found this Chinese name, like they may think Sui is a Chinese name, but they're saying that's not a family name. Traditionally, there's a very small number of family surnames.
How many roughly would there be?
There's an old tradition that was told that in a town there might be a place of mailboxes for mail to be put, and people again you could put mail there for each family, and that there would never need to be more than 100 boxes. Often people who have Australian Chinese sounding names, they're probably not going to be their real Chinese family name. Sometimes some of the records that they've actually they've corrected for that, some haven't. So the best way to actually understand which is the correct name is if you can actually find it in Chinese characters.
If they don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese or
Yeah,
read or write, you need to have someone that can help you with that.
and that writing can actually confirm stuff, and that's also a very important. So we'll get to that later too. But so name order, paper names. A lot of times Chinese would adopt a name in Australia as well, just because their Chinese name may have been either difficult to pronounce or was more of a pain trying to get them to spell it correctly each time. So they may have adopted other surnames, and they just didn't pick one out of the hat. On one of my families, they picked the surname Wilson. Why Wilson? Apparently, the town that they were growing up in, there were no Wilsons in that town, but they'd heard of that surname from another town, sort of somewhere else. So they thought, well, there's no Wilsons here. We'll use that one, and so they used Wilson.
I suppose that's as good a reason as any other reason, isn't it?
Yeah. The point is that the process by which these names and records evolve has been not as precise as we might think.
So in other words, there's quite a little bit of detective work that you need to do to sort of sort through all the material.
Can be, yeah, yeah. Which just adds to the fun of the exercise too, really. So
Yeah, I suppose that for people that have a very inquisitive mind, there's a lot that you can delve into.
yes, indeed.
I've read that tracing your family history can be a bit like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, and it's very easy to head off down a rabbit hole when you start delving into your past. And you probably just outlined some bits of information that can be quite confusing, I suppose, when you're starting to do your research. Can you provide any other good tips or hints that will make the process any easier for people starting out in their family history research?
It's great to sort of start off by gathering things and just shoving them in a shoebox, which is where a lot of family tree research starts off. But the guidance that you get out of a lot of the books, any of the websites about how to order and record stuff is very important. So I happen to use software to do that. You don't have to, but it just makes it a heck of a lot easier. Recording, you're keeping track of your research. Like, for instance, you might have a person and you're researching and you've got a date of birth. Make sure you know where you got the information for that date of birth from. Because when you get another date of birth from a different source, you're going to want to be able to just try and compare them and say, like, oh, I've got two different records here, and which one's the right one? If you've not written that stuff down and you just got a date and you think, where did I get that date from? You're making your rod for your own back there by having to re-research your own research to try and work out how did you come up with it. So that sort of organisation really good, really important, because the nature of the puzzle is that you need to just be able to manage your information.
Because I know you said earlier that one of your relatives, there wasn't a birth certificate for them. So for most people, the birth certificate is probably where you start, but that would make it very hard if you haven't got that information to hand.
Exactly, we had two traditions that said that his date of birth was some other dates. We've been hammering the systems trying to find stuff that was in that date range. The years after, we came up with this other bit of information. In my records, I can actually record the fact that I've got three potential dates of birth and one that is backed by information which I think is very correct. I'm happy to say, like, this is the right one. These two are other ones that we knew about that are wrong. There are other factoids within my family tree where I've got two or three candidates and I haven't worked out which one's the right one yet, and we're still working on that one. So,
So you've still got a bit more research to
oh
do.
yeah, there's.
And how long do you think that might take you to find out all that information?
Will I ever finish? I don't know. I don't know. There's information out there that I haven't accessed yet, and when I am able to, or when it comes to light, then there'll be more things to find out about. We're not in a bad place just now because there's so much information that has become more available, particularly for online research, and more information is being indexed and being made available. As that amount of information keeps growing, there's going to be more stuff for us to mine.
Yeah, so it's making it much easier now for people to go back and find more information about their past and their relatives. So I did actually want to ask what other resources you might be able to suggest for anyone interested in furthering their research. And I know on the Chinese Australian Historical Society website you do have a link there with resources. So could you give us a little bit more information about some of those?
You can start with the more normal sorts of research assets within your own family. You're looking for your own family records, for the letters, for the photos, for the family Bibles, for the old books. The extra that I would recommend people keep their eye open for is anything which has a Chinese character written in it. So the back of a photo, which has someone's name on it, and then another little bit of scroll on the side that no one's recognised. They're bits of information which can be quite a goldmine. All the records that are the original records, they ought to be looked with that extra eye to say, is there anything else there? We've seen records that are indexed through the archive sites that have like information about a certain person. But then occasionally you'll find someone who's actually signed their name twice with an English name and a Chinese name. So those sorts of things, you'll only really ever see that if you can look at the original record. There are many ways in which records are being indexed now, or they're being searchable through some of the commercial websites. But usually those indexes don't index that little bit of information as well, that Chinese character, because usually it's too hard for them to actually do that. They often don't have enough Chinese readers to be able to read through all those annotations on the record as well. So as much as possible, being able to look at the original records and see whether there is anything on the back that is a Chinese character, for instance, that's critical. Going on to immigration records, as I mentioned, the White Australia policy generated a lot of interesting documentation. There's a particular one which is of special interest to Chinese Australian historians, and that is these documents called certificates of exemption from a dictation test. The CEDT is a worthy of a whole episode of its own as well. But essentially, think of it like a passport, because Chinese Australians weren't eligible for a passport during those years. So the CEDT became a bit of a sort of a makeshift passport for someone who was in Australia and looking to travel back to China and return again. These records have been maintained, and large parts of them have been retained in the archives. They're searchable by the English name that someone travelled under. It has information about their travel dates. Some of the associated records link us back to information about when they first came to Australia, because you were only eligible for a CEDT if you basically landed before Federation. And the photos can also be a great record for people who don't have many other photos, or might not have other images of their Chinese Australian forebears. The CEDTs often have a photo with them, so that's really useful too. And there are other immigration records as well that you should become conversant with, and there's plenty of guidance on our website to other links that talk about how the CEDTs are worked out and how they can be searched. The other really interesting resource that's good for Chinese family research are tombstones. Genealogists are always interested in tombstones. We're not all macabre, but they're useful. More so for the Chinese ones. Goes another cultural issue again. So probably up until the Second World War, the expectation for many Chinese, not all, but many Chinese, The expectation was that their family would actually transfer their bones back to China for long-term burial. So the intention was that if they died in Australia, they might be buried here, but after a few years, the bones would be exhumed, packed up, and then taken back to China to be buried in some family location back in China. They sort of adopted the Australian habits of other tombstones, so the shapes and the fact that there's a name on it and a date. Often that's been picked up as well because they're fitting in with the Australian method and process. If there was an intention for the guy to go back to China, they would often include his Chinese name in Chinese characters, and they would often include the village that he came from because that's where he was supposed to be reburied to. Finding out that link of where he came from is really, really, really critical because the village that you come from in China is where your family records are going to be as well. Until recently, China didn't have a formal recording of names system like registrars, and there was no sort of government body that did that. The recording of who you were and where you were in the family were in family records that were kept in each village that you came from. And those villages were very static. The village that I come from has 16 generations in the one village and two surnames. So we come from places, they're pretty static. So the village becomes critical to understand where you came from and where you might find the rest of the records for your family.
So there's certainly a lot of information there for people to look at if they want to go down that path of researching their family history.
You start with the records you've got. So whatever information you've got, you start with that and you just start working backwards and start chipping away. And when you find an immigration record, that's great. You'll know how to look at it. When you find a tombstone, you'll know what to do with it. It's a little bit different, but it is otherwise the same as any other family history research.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I hope that lots of people have been inspired today by your information about researching your Chinese Australian family history. So, thank you so much for your time today, Kerry, and good luck with furthering your own family's history.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you're interested in finding out more information about researching your Chinese Australian family history, the library has a number of genealogy resources available, including Ancestry.com, amongst others. Please check our website or contact the library for further details. And don't forget to look out for more upcoming digital content through the Inner West Library What's On and social media channels.